Thank you. I'd like to thank ATA for invited us here and for giving us the opportunity to share some of the data that we have collected in the region about attitudes towards extremism and terrorism. My brief remarks are not going to be highly opinionated as an academician. I will stick to just presenting some of the data, and then in the Q&A session, I would be more than happy to elaborate on any points that you may have. Just in a way of introduction, I will use one of the phrases used by an American historian and expert on the Middle East, Josh Landis. He talked about the great sorting out. And the great sorting out in reference to history, contemporary modern history of Europe during the Second World War, where you had, for example, ethnic and sectarian religious cleansing was going on, the civil wars, etc. In Poland, for example, you have 64%. At 1939, they were Polish. By the end of the war, almost 100% of people living in Poland were Poles. The same applies to Czechoslovakia with 24%, where minorities then, by the end of the war, all of them gone. This is something that, just in comparison, that is oftentimes in history takes place because of the instabilities and the wars that start in different places. This is not to say that the Middle East must go through the same course of history in order to get the sorting out done. But if you allow me, I'd like just to say a few things about another sort of sorting out, if you wish, in the region that is taking place, and it is the changing trends in attitudes towards terrorism and radical movements. And if you allow me just to show some of the data. Is it on screen? Yes. Back in 2004, that is over 11 years ago, we began to ask questions about terrorism and radical movements. One of the questions was on Al-Qaeda. Do you think it's a legitimate resistance organization, or is it a terrorist organization? What we have seen over the course of history, that there has been a fundamental shift in public opinion. I'm presenting some data from Jordan now, but that applies to many other countries in the region. The time will not allow to present all of that, just to give you a glimpse of it. In 2004, 67% of adult Jordanians thought that Al-Qaeda was a legitimate resistance organization. Today, it's only 10%, and that is a significant change in public opinion throughout the 10 years. But if you look at more recent data from Iraq, the same question, and you look at the number of people or the percentage of people who defined Al-Qaeda as a terrorist movement compared by or broken down by sect, you'd see that 96% of Sunnis defined it as a terrorist movement compared to 98% of Shiites and 91% of Muslims. And those who did not define themselves as a Muslim or a Shia, just chose to be a Muslim. So if you look at Hezbollah, the same trend takes place. 84% back in 2004 defined Hezbollah as legitimate resistance organization. Today, only 24% define Hezbollah. That's latest March 2015, defined Hezbollah as a legitimate resistance organization. And at the same time, the percentage of people who are defining that political party as a terrorist movement has gone up to almost half of the population in Jordan. And if you look at the breakdown of the same question in Iraq, for example, 51% of the Sunnis of Iraq define Hezbollah as terrorist compared to 7% of the Shia and 36% of those who define themselves as Muslims. Now that tells you about the sorting out in terms of attitude. Now people are taking positions according to their political affiliation or what they think is their political affiliation that would serve their survival. In Syria, just a quick run on this, you would see that there is this trend of allying oneself with a political party like Hezbollah. you would find that in governorates, Syrian governorates that are known to be Alawites or Shia, they would less percentage in these governorates would define Hezbollah as a terrorist movement, and more they would define the Hezbollah as a terrorist movement in Sunni-controlled or Sunni areas such as Idlib or Aleppo. If you compare that according to the areas controlled by the Syrian government or the Syrian opposition or ISIL, again, you would find this sorting out is taking place. For example, only 40% of people who live in areas under the control of the Syrian government say Hezbollah is a terrorist movement, compared to 59% who say not. It is not the case in areas that are controlled by ISIS or by other opposition groups. ISIS itself, and this is data from Jordan, today 89% of Jordanians defined ISIS as a terrorist group. That a few months ago, back in August 2014, it was only 62%. So we have seen a huge shift in attitudes towards that organization that is partly caused by the killing of the Jordanian pilot Mu'adh Qasas and the brutal way that he was killed. In Iraq, you see a consensus among Iraqis, whether Sunni or Shia, that 97% of Iraqi Sunni define ISIS as a terrorist movement, compared to 99% among the Shiites and 82% of the Muslim. In Syria, again, the same pattern is repeated. In Sunni-controlled areas, you would find less percentage of people defining it as a terrorist movement, unlike the Shia-controlled areas such as Tartus and Latakia and Damascus also. The Houthi group in Yemen, again, there's an increase in number of people who are defining that movement as a terrorist organization, from as low as 39% back in August last year to 67%. And the interesting thing about those is that the more people know about these movements, they tend to shift towards a negative position on these movements. So the more information you know about them, the more likely you would say that this is a terrorist movement rather than a resistance or not a terrorist movement. In Syria, the same applies again. So the pattern is continuing. Asaib Ahl al-Haq in Iraq, or al-Hashd al-Sha'bi, the same pattern continues. So basically, the point I'd like to leave you with is this, from this, that in addition to the realignment of people with the sectarian identities that are emerging in the region, there is also another trend that people tend to define these movements. The more they know information about, they tend to define them as terrorist movements, except in the areas that are controlled by Shia or Sunni according to the origin of that organization. Now, there is another link to this, which is the perception of a threat, that the majority of people in the region, they perceive ISIS as constituting a serious security threat to the region. And I think the most important item of all would be, and that is the question that everyone is asking and no one has the answer to, how many people are sympathetic, or what is the size of the incubating environment for these movements in the region? Assuming, this is some data from Jordan, you have today a 96% when asked which of the following organizations present your views, Qaeda, ISIS, or Nusra, you would find 96% saying none of them. But still, if there is 1 or 2% saying it does represent my view, that is a significant number of people. If you take a country like Egypt with almost 100 million people, and you ask the adult population of that country this question, and you will get 1% of those saying it represents my, you are talking about millions of people. Now, the question is, do we know if we are making a progress on de-radicalization in the region or not? I don't think I claim to be a close follower of research on this area, and I haven't seen systematic effort to tell me that actually, yes, the programs that were implemented in Turkey or in Egypt or in Yemen or in Saudi Arabia or in Morocco or in Libya are making progress. Why? Because there isn't systematic evaluation of these programs, if they existed in the first place. The second point is that we tend to make assumptions. And the assumptions are usually, our colleague here mentioned that despite the billions that they were spent on counter-radicalization and counter-terrorism, we are seeing more terrorist attacks and more radicals and more terrorists coming into the field. So I think that's a very important question. Why is this happening? Is it because there is an intention to have this kind of activity continuing, or is it just because the programs that are being implemented are ineffective and we don't know about the effectiveness of those programs? So basically, my final word in this, I think there is a serious need to fill a very serious gap in the literature and in the policy circles on knowing how many supporters, how many sympathizers are there for those movements, and what is the translation rate from being a sympathetic person to being an activist and later a terrorist. If you think of 8 layers of action that one person may take, the last one of them would be to carry a weapon and go fight in Syria or elsewhere. And the final point, that people who are going to Syria to fight there, the 5,000 were mentioned earlier, or the 5,500, less or more, they're not only going to fight with ISIS. We have to be very clear about that. There are people who are going to fight with Nusra, with many other 50, 70 organizations. Some of them claim to be Islamist, others do not. But also there's on the other side, there are people who are flooding from Iraq, from Iran, from Afghanistan, from Pakistan, from Yemen, from Western Europe to fight with the regime, again on sectarian basis. So I think this should not be also confused with that everyone is going to Syria to fight with ISIS. And I leave it at that and leave the rest for Q&A. Thank you.